Hey, shalom, it's Izzy here with Holy Language Institute at holylanguage.com. And yes, I do have my Hebrew letters coffee cup here. We just finished a Hebrew verses lesson reading through the first half of Romans chapter 3 in Hebrew. It's a translation into biblical style Hebrew. And I'm using that as a springboard to talk about different like Hebrew related topics and topics related to Judaism. You have to remember that, Paul described himself as a Jew. He said, I'm a Jew. He described himself as a Hebrew of Hebrews. And it's really interesting how in his epistle to the Romans, we definitely see Hebrew thought patterns and ways of communicating throughout this epistle. And of course, many references also to the Hebrew Bible. I wanted to show you an example of this, a word that he used, and use it to springboard into talking about Zionism. The early Zionist movement, some of the early Zionist leaders, and then also the Zionist state, the state of Israel. And so let's look at this firstly here. So this is the translation of Romans into Hebrew. And we were reading, like I said, roughly the first half. I want to show you one word specifically. All right. So Paul poses, throughout this epistle, Paul poses questions. And you can tell he wasn't just making these questions up. You could tell, like, this was stuff that people were actually saying. And so he would pose the question theoretically, and then he would shoot it down and tear it apart. And that was, and hopefully he put some of these questions to rest in people's minds and they quit saying dumb stuff like some of these things. So here's an example for you in this letter. In Romans chapter 3, verse 3, he says, what then? If some didn't believe, so referring to the Jewish people, if some of the Jewish people didn't believe, their unbelief will not nullify the faithfulness of God. Will it? All right, so take note of this. In the verses directly prior to this, Paul talks about being Jewish. He talks about Jewish identity. And he speaks, firstly, he recognizes the ongoing validity of Jewish identity. There are still Jews, there are still Gentiles, even after the coming of the Messiah, even in the New Covenant. And he doesn't just recognize that distinction. He also speaks in overwhelmingly positive terms about being Jewish. What advantage has the Jew? What is the benefit of circumcision? Great in every respect. First of all, that they were entrusted with the oracles of God. So God gave Israel the Torah. God entrusted, His holy words in the prophecy of Moses and the other prophets to the Jewish people. And then, so in response to that fact, there's this question. If some didn't believe, what then? Their unbelief won't nullify the faithfulness of God, will it? And basically, he explodes in response to that very idea. And he says, this is how it's translated in the New American Standard. May it never be. Now the problem with this translation is this isn't how people talk. Like seriously, have you ever heard anyone in like just normal everyday conversation be like, may it never be? Like you don't say that, you know what I mean? So the question is, in English, like what's the best phrase to capture this idea? And not just like in a cold literal word for word way, but like in a way that has that emotional resonance. Like like that kind of reaction. May it never be. That's the question. Well, I'll tell you what the Hebrew word is that does carry that emotional resonance. It's the word that Franz Delitzsch used in his, in his translation. So let's look at that right here. Here's the word, chalila. The word in Hebrew to express this, not just this idea, but this feel, is chalila. Chalila! And he's going to use this word a whole bunch of times in this letter because he's going to keep raising these like theoretical questions that some people were actually believing, and then he reacts by saying Chalila, and then he tears it apart, and he gives the truth instead, which is fantastic. All right, so I want to look with you at this word Chalila, and then we're going to talk a little bit about Zionism. It's a really interesting word, Chalila. It's used throughout the Hebrew scriptures in the Tanakh. And the first time it's used, I'll show you the first time it's used here. It's in the book of Genesis, in the story about Abraham and Lot and Sodom, the city of Sodom, and its environs. And so like Abraham is trying to negotiate with God to not destroy the whole city of Sodom because he doesn't want Lot to die. So he says, so what if there are like 50 tzaddikim, like 50 righteous people in the city? Like you're not going to destroy it when there are like 50 good people there, and are you? I'm paraphrasing. And then this is how it's translated here. Far be it from you to do such a thing. Far be it from you. All right. Now, do people like really talk like this in English? No, we don't. The Hebrew here is chalila, from you, like chalila. So what does the word Chalila mean? Okay, well, it comes from the verb halal. The word halal means to profane something, or like it has a sense of sacrilege or profanity. So it's like that would be sacrilegious for you to do that. Profanity is kind of the idea. If you can like think, Princess Bride style profanity, it's kind of like that. All right, so that's Khalila. All right, so this word is used throughout the Hebrew scriptures, and I want to show you a really interesting thing about this word. Let's see, let's bring it up here. All right, so Khalila, this is from like a biblical Hebrew dictionary by Harkavi. You can get it off the resources page at holylanguage.com. Really handy. So it's an interjection. He points out here it's from the verb halal, which we already talked about. It's profane. Profane be it. Far be it, God forbid. All right, so that's one way that if you're Jewish, you might say like God forbid or heaven forbid. That would kind of be like an English Jewish equivalent of this may it never be phrase. And then, in the dictionary it lists some examples of this. Like Chalila li me'asot, so God forbid that I should do this thing. It's kind of how it's used. Now what's interesting about this word is there's another word that is used later on in the history of the Hebrew language. So in earlier Hebrew, you'll frequently you'll see this word Chalila. It has the sense of sacrilege. Now later on in Hebrew, the word chas was used. Chas. This is more like Hebrew from the Second Temple era, and then after that. So you could say that this is Mishnaic Hebrew or Rabbinic Hebrew, and the word used is chas. So sometimes, to this very day in Judaism, you'll hear the phrase like chas v'chalila, chas v'chalila. It's this doubled up expression. If you hear something that's just absolutely unthinkable, then you'd say chas v'chalila. Okay, so here's the interesting thing. Chas here has the same sense, God forfend. There's a nice old English word for you. God forfend. Don't say that. Okay, now this is probably one of the best English equivalents right here. Don't say that, because that is something that we would say in English. If someone says something that's absolutely outrageous and it just infuriates you and it's the dumbest thing you've ever said and it's just wrong, then what would you say in response to that? Well, maybe you would say like, don't say that. So where Paul says may it never be in his letters, think of don't say that in English, or God forbid, or maybe in if you were to be speaking in Hebrew, you'd say Chalila or Chas v'Chalila. Now what's interesting about this word Chas here is that it's actually used in the Targum. So you have the Hebrew Bible, and then you have a translation of the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic. That's referred to as the Targum, and there are several of them. They're referred to as the Targumim. In Genesis, where in the original Hebrew you have Chalila, in the Targum you have Chas, right? So it's basically like Chalila is the earlier Hebrew word, biblical Hebrew word that's used. Chas is the later rabbinic Hebrew word that's kind of Aramaic actually that's used, and then sometimes they're doubled up as Chas v'Chalila. All right, so that's a little Hebrew lesson for you. I will show you one interesting thing. One of the things I love about eSword is you can load it up with all of your favorite Bible translations, and also some of maybe your least favorite ones. If you like to look at really bad Bible translations and just get mad at how bad they are, you can load it up with those too. And then you can hit this compare button, and it'll show you like how a verse is translated in all of your favorite and your least favorite Bible translations. All right, so let's have a look at this this may it never be translation, because it's really interesting. Romans chapter 3 verse 4, may it never be. So now we're going to hit compare, and check this out, because in almost every translation it's phrased differently. Complete Jewish Bible, heaven forbid. ESV, by no means. Good News Bible, certainly not. King James, God forbid. NASB, may it never be. A couple others here. NIV, not at all. New Living, of course not. That's a good one. I like that one. Of course not. It's like duh. And then a couple others here that basically we already saw those phrases. All right, so you can see that like this little phrase, like translators have a really hard time. They're like grasping to try and capture the full sense of it. So now that we looked at this phrase, and in Hebrew, like we said, it's Chalila, or maybe it's Chas v'Chalila. Let's look at like this idea that Paul reacted to, and we'll see whether that idea is maybe still out there, because it is actually. It's still out there, and I really think that Paul would react today if he heard some of the stuff that people say. Specifically, I want to talk about the history of the Jewish people in the last 150 years and the state of Israel today. All right, okay, here's the deal. like, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the early Zionist movement, but there were some guys in the mid to late 1800s who believed that it was time for the Jewish people to return to the land of Israel and live in the land of Israel. I mean, it kind of makes sense, the people of Israel in the land of Israel. And like, if you're Jewish and you pray all the prayers, like we pray about this all the time, going back to Israel. Passover Seder next year in Jerusalem. If you read the Torah and if you read the prophets, you see it all over the place. God is like, yes, I'm going to exile you to all the nations. I'm going to scatter you all over the world. And then, that's not the end of the story, I'm going to bring you back. Like, he said it over and over again. And so basically, in the 1800s was the beginning of the Zionist movement, where there was this like awakening amongst the Jewish people that it was time to go home. And I highly recommend that you read the history of early Zionism, because it's really fascinating on a couple levels. For one thing, it's supernatural. You read the story of Eliezer ben Yehuda, for instance. He was one of the early father figures in the Zionist movement. He had a passion to see the ancient language of Hebrew restored as a modern language, the language of the newly emerging state of Israel, basically. And he had a fascinating story, because he was so sick he was almost dead for years and years and years, but he had this passion that drove him, and he actually had an open vision in which he heard the audible voice of God, and that set the trajectory for his life and his vision to see the Jewish people restored to speaking Hebrew again as a living modern language. So I highly recommend you read the story of Eliezer ben Yehuda, and I dare you to say that that's not a supernatural story, because I really believe that it is. That would be an example. Theodor Herzl was, sometimes referred to as the father of Zionism. Would be another example. Now, here's the interesting okay, and then, as a result of these guys, there were waves of Jewish immigration back to, Palestine, as that was referred to then, back to the land of Israel. And that really began happening in the 1880s. And I really believe that was a move of God. Now, here's the thing. There are people today, including, well-meaning Christians, who will point to the early Zionist movement and will say, well, like Theodor Herzl, like, he was something between an atheist and an agnostic. Like, he was not a religious Jew. He wasn't Torah observant. Maybe he didn't even believe in God, at least not the way the Bible describes God. So, obviously he was a write-off. Obviously whatever he was doing was... it didn't have any legitimacy from a biblical perspective. Sometimes people will say that. Same thing with Eliezer ben Yehuda. Yes, he did have some spiritual experiences. Yes, he was very passionate about this ancient promise about the Jewish people coming home. He was very passionate about seeing that fulfilled. But at the same time, he wasn't a religious Jew. And in fact, most of the Jewish people who went back to Israel in the 1800s weren't religious Jews. The state of Israel it's a secular state. So people will point to that, to the early Zionist movement and also to the state of Israel today, and they'll be like, well, obviously that's not a move of God because it's not perfect, because all of these people weren't faithful Jews, or maybe some of them were even atheists. Maybe the majority of them were atheists. Therefore, that can't be of God. All right. Now, I want you to stop and think about that for a moment before you actually believe that. What did Paul say in Romans chapter 3? Paul said, okay, what if? What if some of the Jewish people don't believe the Torah? Like, what if they're not faithful to the Torah? What if they don't even believe in God? Does their unbelief nullify the faithfulness of God? Paul's answer to that idea is, Chalila. Don't say that. All right, so take note of that. Even if every Jewish person in the world was an atheist, God would still be true to his ancient promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the things that he said he would do in the Torah. An example would be Deuteronomy chapter 30. God said, I'm going to scatter you amongst the nations, and then in the Acharit Hayamim, in the end of days, you are going to remember the Torah, you're going to return to me, I'm going to bring you back to the land of Israel, and I'm going to cleanse you. And then, he talked about the new covenant experience. God said similar things in the book of Ezekiel. What's interesting in Ezekiel is he didn't say he would clean the Jewish people up and then take them home to Israel. He said he would take them home to Israel and then he would clean them up. Then he would give us a new heart and a new spirit and, remove our idols and all of this stuff. So I just want you to be encouraged by that. Even though the history of Zionism is not religious history as such, even though some of the early Zionist leaders were not religious Jews, even though the state of Israel is a secular state, it doesn't mean it's not of God. It doesn't mean there isn't an underlying move of his Holy Spirit behind these things happening in history. I believe that these things are of God. I believe that he has brought the Jewish people back to the land of Israel because he is faithful. He is faithful to himself. He's faithful to his covenant promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's faithful to what he said he would do in the Torah, for instance, in Deuteronomy chapter 30, and in the prophets, for instance, in the prophet Ezekiel. So, praise God for that fact. Let's celebrate that fact. Let's remember that just because some Jewish people are atheists, just because some of the early Zionist leaders were not religious Jews, let's remember that God has not ceased to be faithful to his people and to his word. So that was a little takeaway from the lesson, our Hebrew verses lesson. I'd love to have you studying with us in a more in a fuller way. Come visit us at holylanguage.com. Become a member. We do new lessons pretty much every week, like this, just reading through the Bible together in Hebrew, talking about and using that as a springboard to talk about these relevant things. So again, I'd love to have you become a member. And either way, I'm glad we could talk about this because I think it's a big question that really deserves being talked about. All right, well, shalom to you, and hopefully you'll join me for another one of these lesson takeaways in the near future.